Welcome back, class. We're going to jump into the third segment here and talk about substitution income effects. We've talked about them previously. I can't remember what chapter it was, maybe chapter 3, maybe chapter 4. I can't remember. We've talked about them previously. We're going to get a little more detail in this section. But this section starts out in the text that the authors are talking about how they move from an individual demand curve to a market demand curve. And it's, basically they state that the market demand curve is the sum of individual quantities demanded across all consumers. So you're summing the individual demand curves across all consumers in that given market. And they sometimes in some texts you will hear it referred to as summing horizontally, because it's the horizontal of some individual demand curves that's what you're summing as you go across, because you're summing the quantities as you go across. And individuals, they are utility maximizing adjustments to market prices, and that's why we end up, again, law of demand with a downward sloping demand curve. Now, to talk just a few minutes about just the substitution and income effect, just in general, before we really get into the nuts and bolts. So basically what happens on the substitution effect is price changes. It drives the market trade-off changes. So I think in the text they talk about apples and oranges. You can talk about coffee and tea. You can talk about beef and pork, or beef and chicken, or pork and chicken, or which are talking about the substitution effect, because the substitutes cheaper goods for the more expensive ones. So that's basically your substitution effect. Price drops, you substitute the cheaper good for the more expensive good. And if you kind of take the substitution effect and set it aside, and you look at the income effect, when the price of a good drops, the consumer actually gets richer. When they talk about getting richer, you have, as the price drops, it's going to, let's say you're one of those individuals that has to have a Starbucks coffee every morning. And if the price drops on that Starbucks coffee, I don't know what a cup of coffee is. Let's say it's, I don't know, $4 a cup, or especially if you get some of those, the woo-woo coffee drinks, maybe more than that. But let's say it's $4 and all of a sudden it drops to $3, which I doubt Starbucks is ever going to do. But I'm an economist. I live in a somewhat unrealistic world, and my market says that Starbucks drops it to $3. I've got an extra dollar for, let's say the month of October. I've got $31 extra to do with something else. So it's making me richer because I can take and transfer that extra $31 to doing something else and maximize some more total utility. So the income effect is a drop in price of a good. Each dollar's worth more, and it's, when in economics you're talking about your real, they talk about the real wage rate, and that's a wage rate divided by the price, and it gets you a real wage rate. So now I've got a real wealth rate because my real wealth is going up. Because again, dollars divided by price, what happens if the denominator gets smaller? Your ratio is going to get bigger. The impact, and then when we'll talk about it in a few minutes, that impacts are different between normal and inferior goods. But go back to, again, I can't remember what chapter it was, chapter 3, chapter 4, the downward sloping demand curve, the individual downward sloping demand curve is downward sloping for two reasons. The substitution effect, because as price gets cheaper, the law of demand says you're going to buy more of a good or service. Substitution effect, you're substituting from a more expensive good or service, you're substituting down to a cheaper one. Oranges are more expensive than apples. are oranges and apples the same price, then the price of apples drops. You're going to take some money you may have been spending on oranges and you're going to drop it down and buy more apples. And it also is downward sloping because of the income effect. As you're making that reallocation of your budget from oranges to apples, beef to pork, pork to chicken, whatever that too good model looks like that you're playing with, as you're allocating from more expensive to cheaper, you're also, now you have more dollars. I mean, hey, I've got more dollars to spend now. I may spend it on something else. So downward sloping demand curve is impacted by the substitution effect, and it's impacted by the income effect. And we're also going to get into, in a few minutes, we're going to get into how that impacts, and it's going to change. It's going to be different for a normal good as it is for, it's not going to be the same for a normal good as an inferior good. And remember, we talked about these goods, again, back in one of the earlier chapters, that as income increases, you're going to buy more of a normal good. As income increases, you're going to buy less of an inferior good. And it's just the opposite. If income decreases, you're going to buy more of an inferior good, but you're going to buy less of a normal good. So remember, we talked about that in the past, and we'll continue to use that throughout, at least this portion of this chapter. And from an economic perspective, they bring in they talk about a concept of income compensated price change. And again, it's an economic concept that economists use to help explain not only the downward sloping demand curve, but to explain how there's a different, or how they differentiate between normal and inferior goods. And they define it as an imaginary exercise in which we assume that when the price of a good or service changes, the consumer's income is adjusted so that he or she has just enough to purchase the original combination of goods and services at the new set of prices. And they do it that way because it's easier to play around with the substitution income effect. And so with that income compensated price change, if you think about the substitution effect, the change in a consumer's consumption of a good in response to an income compensated price change, that's a substitution effect, a change in the consumption in a direction opposite to the change in price. Make sense? What do we say about the law of demand? Price goes down, consumption goes up. Price goes up, consumption goes down. Downward sloping demand curve. And that's what the substitution effect is telling you here. And the consumer, if they're utility maximizers, which again, we're going to assume everybody's utility maximizer, and it's the speed at which the change in the marginal utility, remember, marginal utility of X divided by the price of X, price goes down, that marginal utility ratio gets larger, remember? Down, smaller denominator, larger ratio. So it's the speed in which that is the magnitude of the effect of that marginal utility ratio. So the faster it happens, the less the effect, because individuals have more of an opportunity to change things. It's when the price goes down between two goods and services, you start allocating dollars. You'll allocate $1. You'll look at the ratio. And if the ratio is not equal between the two goods, remember, marginal benefit and marginal cost, you'll allocate another $1. And you keep allocating those dollars from the expensive one to the inexpensive one until you get those two, marginal benefit and marginal cost, until you get them equal. And what the text or what the authors are saying, or what economists will tell you, is the faster that happens, the less the impact or the magnitude of the magnitude of that substitution effect is going to be smaller. So the speed of the change in marginal utility will determine the magnitude of the substitution effect. So again, increase in income, compensated price change, increase. If it goes up, quantity demanded goes down. If it comes down, quantity demanded goes up. And that's going to be, the same similar impact with that ratio, because you're talking about the marginal utility of a good per dollar spent on that good. So take that substitution effect, set it aside. We're going to grab now the income effect. And the income effect, the change in consumption of a good resulting from the implicit change in an income because of a price change. And where speed impacted the magnitude of the substitution effect, it's the budget, it's the percent of the budget that impacts the magnitude of the income effect. So the larger the percentage of your budget, the larger or the greater the magnitude of the income effect. And it's in response to quantity demanded to a price change. So what you're looking at, and they also throw another little wrinkle in down toward the end, because they talk about as the increase in the magnitude of the substitution effect also increases the price elasticity of demand. Remember, we talked about PED in chapter 5 or 6.1. I don't remember which one, but in one of the early chapters. So now they're trying, now the authors tie the substitution effect back to the price elasticity of demand, which kind of a wrinkle they sneak in there at the end. But it's a good wrinkle, and it's an important wrinkle, and we may use that wrinkle somewhere down the road in one of these future chapters. And now we get to the normal good and the inferior goods. And the normal goods, the income effect reinforces the substitution effect. If it's an inferior good, the income effect works in the opposite direction of the substitution effect. So if it's a normal good, the income and substitution effects, both impacts are working in the same direction, and it's increasing the quantity demanded. If it's an inferior good, they're working in the opposite direction, and which one has the greater magnitude or the greater impact is going to determine how much that quantity demanded increases. It may increase some, but if they're working in opposite to each other, and let's say the income effect is a greater magnitude than the substitution effect, it won't expand that quantity demanded hardly as much. And if you go back to what we talked about, and again, the earlier chapters, as income increases, quantity demanded of a normal good increases. Income decreases, quantity demanded decreases. They move in the same direction. If you're talking about an inferior good, as income increases, the quantity demanded of that inferior good decreases, because now you've got more income. You're not going to be eating SpaghettiOs or eating cereal at night for dinner. You're going to go out and buy you a piece of beef or some fish or something, and you're going to improve the utility you get from spending that dollar. Again, all of this ties back to utility, total utility, marginal utility. It's the authors are trying to tie all these pieces together at this point. And so if you want to talk about normal goods, the price of the good decreases, causes a substitution effect to increase the quantity demanded. There's also a corresponding increase in real income, which causes an increase in the quantity demanded, and that's your income effect. They work together to push out the consumption, to increase the quantity demanded of the good or service. And the opposite holds true if there's a price increase. So, just think about it, that, price decreases, pushes it out. Price increases, contracts it, expands, contracts. So that's the substitution and income effect on the quantity demanded of a normal good. Now let's flip to the quantity demanded of an inferior good. As the price of the good decreases, the quantity demanded increases due to the substitution effect, but the quantity demanded also decreases back, so it's pulled back a little due to the increase in real income on the income effect. They work in opposite directions. And the reason they're working in opposite directions can't remember the example they used in the book. May have been tuna fish or spam or something. I don't remember. But when the price decreased on that inferior good, you start to buy more of it. But at the same time, you've got some extra money in your pocket, and you think, well, I don't have to eat inferior, consume this inferior good 7 days of the week. Maybe I'll only consume it now 4 days of the week, and I've got 3 days of the week. I'm going to have something else. I'm going to expand my total utility by shifting some dollars to something that I'd rather have. So that's how they offset each other. And the magnitude of the increase on the quantity demanded depends on which one has the greatest impact between the substitution effect and the income effect. And they sneak something in the textbook down toward the end. It was something that professors at Ohio State, talked about, kind of brushed over it when we were talking about marginal utilities and income and substitution effect, because it just I'm not sure it's ever happened. They give an example in the text about some academics that have collected some data that implies that it may exist, but they talk about a Giffen good, and it's a possibility where there's an upward sloping demand curve, that the income effect is so much stronger than the substitution effect. And the economist that came up with this notion, his last name was Giffen, and they rewarded him with terming his concept the Giffen good. So that happens in economics along the way, and but it's something that I'm not sure has ever happened in reality. Maybe it does, but I'm not sure there's enough data to actually put together some substantial impacts of it. So that's where we're going to kind of bring this together. So we've been talking about marginal utility of X divided by the price of X, and how that ratio works depending on how prices work. We've seen how things work when you're talking about a normal good and an inferior good. And now we're going to get into this next segment, and I'm going to pause to give you a chance to catch your breath on this one, because now we're going to talk about indifference curves. And when we come back, we'll get into that, and I'll talk to you in a few minutes. Thank you.